Welcome to the HRIS Careers Podcast with your host, Troy Wallace, a podcast for human resources information systems professionals to help you elevate your HRIS career. We always say no one gets into HRIS on purpose, but it sure is interesting to find out how they did. We interview your HRIS peers to find out how they got tricked into the industry and what lessons and tools they use to progress their careers along the way. We discuss industry trends, AI, and even talk candidly about all the most popular HRIS platforms. Just think of it as the closest bar just outside the entrance of your favorite HR technology conference. Now you get it. Welcome in.
If you wanted to kill that employee, you can do it. I'm going to advise you, there's a 100% chance you're going to jail.
If you suck at recruiting, the only thing technology will do is make you suck faster.
Exactly. It's one of my favorite quotes, and it's been used a lot.
Please tell me you have pictures.
I'm sure somebody does. Like I didn't. I was on stage.
Somewhere.
I was like engulfed in this woman having a giant hug. You know.
What? Welcome to the HRIS Careers Podcast, recording live in our studios in beautiful downtown Omaha, Nebraska. The location, Omaha, Nebraska, is going to have a little bit of connective tissue and relevance in this episode. Today, with our guest, we have absolutely outkicked our coverage. We're punching above our weight, or whatever other sports analogy you want to use. Just have a guest that we probably shouldn't be able to get. So, our thanks to Lori Rudiman from the Punk Rock HR podcast for making a recommendation and connection on this one. We certainly appreciate that. Our guest is Tim Sackett. He is a 20-year HR and recruiting talent pro with a master's in HR. He has his what used to be called SPHR, now it is a SHRM Senior Certified Professional designation, currently residing in Lansing, Michigan. He is currently the president at HRU Technical Resources, which is a $40 million IT and engineering contract staffing and recruitment process outsourcing RPO firm. He is a prolific writer and speaker on all things HR with an incredible knowledge on talent acquisition and the technology that impacts it. So he shares what I would say is sometimes his irreverent takes on Twitter and at his blog, timsackett.com. Again, that's TIMSACKETT.com. He has been a speaker at Disrupt HR and the HR Technology Conference, among many, many other conferences. If you visit his LinkedIn profile, you'll be greeted with,
Holla at your boy, holla at your boy, holla at your boy, holla at your boy.
And most importantly, just released his new book, The Talent Fix, Volume 2, A Leader's Guide to Recruiting Great Talent, which I'm holding in my hand right here if you're watching over on YouTube. Here are the 3 gigantic things you will learn on today's episode. Number 1. What he considers the AK-47 of the HR world. Number 2. How can you get your HR users to stop breaking the HRIS tools that you give them? Number 3. Where to find a masterclass in designing a talent acquisition tech stack that your users will love. As always, make sure and check out the lightning round. We get to it right away in this episode. I did not know Tim Sackett going into this interview, but we found out during our discussion that we actually worked at the same company and in the same building here in Omaha, Nebraska, just 4 or 5 years apart from each other. So a lot of connective tissue. We actually spent the first 20 minutes talking about all these mutual connections. There was a lot of good stuff here that I didn't include in the episode that I may release as part 2. Or if you want me to just email you some of the best nuggets, certainly feel free to email at troy.wallace@HRISCareers.com, and I will send it to you directly. This was a ton of fun. I encourage you to get his new book. If you are a HRIS pro that wants to serve your talent acquisition community better, as always, the show notes will be packed. So please enjoy this wide-ranging and on the edge of controversial discussion with Tim Sackett. Tim Sackett, welcome to the HRIS Careers Podcast. We really appreciate you being here. We actually pressed record about 20 minutes earlier because we thought in the pre-show we'd get into some interesting things, and we did. And we had Old Home Week. We worked in the same building for a couple of years, but a couple of years apart. Yeah. So, Tim, I got your book over the weekend. So Tim has a new book. It's The Talent Fix, A Leader's Guide to Recruiting Great Talent, Volume 2.
Yeah.
And I dug into that, and we're definitely going to get into some chapters there. But first thing, I wanted to throw something by
Sure.
you. So I was listening to, I know, amongst other things, and I will have done, the full intro by the time people listen to this part of the podcast. But you had a lot of interesting things to say about talent, how talent acquisition needs to own retention.
Yeah.
And I was listening to the, I think it's Professor G or the Prof G podcast. His name is Scott Galloway. A lot of interesting takes on that. Talks about HR issues and just business in general. And he made the point that the number one predictor of retention is whether or not a person has a friend at work.
Well, that's the old Gallup research, right? And then the crazy part is like that's 3 decades old Gallup research. And it wasn't a friend at work, it's best friend. So that's also a really good like key indicator difference, right? Because we all can have friends at work, but you do have a best friend at work. Now, the interesting thing was Gallup literally went back and redid that research just in the last year, and the same thing came back. So it basically, if you think of all of the employment research that's been done over the last 3 decades, that best friend at work predictor might be the greatest one that's held up. Like, I think it's amazing. And I tell people all the time, especially when I was in my age, because I've worked on both sides of HR and TA, right? And I've loved both sides. And one of the things I found is on the HR side was it was completely true. Like, you would put up with a really bad boss. You would put up with a bad company, maybe even a bad job, if you had a best friend that was in it with you. At least you'd put up with it way longer, right? So the retention would actually go out there. So yeah, like Prof G picked up on that. I actually saw that probably in the last month or two that Gallup re-released that research, and because they had went back through just to say, hey, is this still valid? And it is. And we just, as organizations, we do not put enough credence into that because I think it's so powerful. I mean, Troy, think of like the jobs that you've had too. Like I go back on my own and take a look at the jobs that I've had most satisfaction in. And every single time I can go back and it's around the people that I was working with had really little to do with the company and the job. It had everything to do with the people I was working with.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, I guess if you reflect back and I think about the good jobs, the bad jobs, absolutely.
Yeah.
I even have a couple opportunities where I have been able to follow somebody.
Yep.
I've worked with them, enjoyed working with them, and then 4 years later, they've got an opportunity, and well, it's a known quantity, right? You're like, okay, I know that person.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of assurance there. So we're going to digress a little bit from work talk, and I've seen you post a couple places that you play point guard on your over 40s men's team.
Yeah.
Now, is this still true, or is that old news?
Well, by the way, the line is I'm the backup point guard. So that was kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke about like, I love basketball, I love HR and recruiting, but I'm not very good, I'm sure. So I was the backup point guard. And I played men's like rec league basketball for a lot of years. Now I play way more golf and pickleball and stuff like that.
Oh, so you've put away the basketball shoes, huh?
For the most part, like I haven't played like a live basketball game for a little bit. But I loved it. For years I would play. And then I had 3 sons, and my oldest son was a player as well. So coached him and continued to play. I used to play every morning, not every morning, like 3 mornings a week with like at the local high school, where a bunch of guys would get together, and it was like the principal of the high school and some teachers and just other guys that from the neighborhood. And so you literally, at 5:30 in the morning, you're playing basketball. And it got to the point where I knew I was getting too old when the younger guys would come and follow me pretty hard. And I'm like, wait a minute, it's 5:30 in the morning and I'm on the ground. Like, something's wrong here. I have a job to get to.
It is. You start to rethink your priorities.
Exactly.
For sure. I think the key for me is you got to continually lower the competition level and the athleticism of the people you play with.
Yes. Yeah.
Everybody's got to be on the same page, or that does not go well. All right, so we know we have to get you out on the hour, and I'm going to have an interesting editing job because we had a bunch of great stuff in the pre-interview that I may have to weave in.
Yeah.
But I never want to miss out on doing what we call the lightning round.
Yeah.
So I always put some imaginary time on the clock, and it'll be 5 questions. I may ask them rapidly,
Yeah.
but you do not have to answer them rapidly.
Okay.
So, all right, here we go. Now, I know you do a lot of speaking. And by the way, I'm extremely jealous of the Cayman event that you spoke at. Just the fact that you got down there on a speaking event, that's maybe a whole nother
Yeah.
thing. But
1,
is there anything, I'll call it the funniest, quirkiest, worst thing that's happened to you at a speaking event conference?
There's a lot. One of the things, especially when you get around like that speaker world and you run into other speakers, I think some of the craziest things that happen is when you never know, like the audience, when you get there, like, is it going to be a jam-packed room with people sitting on the side? Is it going to be 2 or 3 people? And so when I first started speaking, most of it's kind of volunteer. Like you might get your like flight paid for, or you might, get a hotel room, but for the most part, you're not getting paid. I remember one of my first really paid speaking gigs. I think I was getting like $2,500 in travel. So I'm like, okay, hey, I'm getting paid to come speak. I'm a professional speaker. I'm going to go down there. And they're like, okay, hey, you're on at 1:00 and here's your room and blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of this, bigger conference. And there was 3 people in the room. And you're just like, what do you do? Like you have you almost want to pull them together and just say, hey, should we just have a conversation? Because it's going to seem really weird for me to go into an hour's worth of content for the 3 of you. And then when you start talking to like professional speakers, you realize that all of us have those same stories. Everyone's been to an environment. Like I remember one guy was like, yeah, I was going to this, farm construction one in South Dakota. And like I show up and there's a stage and it's 360. I'm surrounded by all these chairs. It's like 5,000 chairs. And I'm like, this is going to be amazing. And I show up the next morning. They had a big blowout party the night before. There was 50 people. There's nobody there. I have this amazing stage. And so to me, those are the funny ones. So I've actually spoken 4 or 5 times in Cayman. And years ago, I did a post about workplace hugging. And so I was in Cayman and I'm doing the workplace hug rules. And this is, again, like 6, 7, 8 years ago. And I asked for a volunteer. And I'm 5'7", 170 pounds. I had a Canadian woman that had to be 6'4", 320 be my partner to hug. And she devoured me into her. Literally picked me off the ground. The audience loved it. They came unglued. They thought it was the funniest thing they've ever seen. So it was great theater from that standpoint.
Please tell me you have pictures.
I'm sure somebody does. Like I didn't. I was on stage. I was like engulfed in this woman having a giant hug.
What? Oh, that is good. Yeah, I could imagine being in a room that big, 3 people show up, like you're hoping that they invite crickets.
Oh
You can
my
hear
gosh.
crickets.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to number 2.
2,
All right, so this comes a little bit from your book. What do you consider the AK-47 in someone's HR arsenal?
I think it's the non-legal, legal ramifications that we know we don't really have legal, like, kinds of things, right? There are things that are legal, illegal, all of that. But like most of employees look at HR like they're lawyers. Like, hey, if I tell you you can't do something because it's against the law, like they just do it. So the AK-47 for, a lot of like HR people is like, hey, I can ask you to come to my office. And because of the legal aspects of what we do in HR, like they, or I can ask to meet with you, they just do it because they're like, they have to. We're almost like the police of the organization in many aspects. And so even like I never wanted employees to be scared of me or be scared to talk with me or meet with me. Because to me, that's the bad way to use your HR power. But we all have it in HR. We all have that kind of power, that AK-47 if we have to pull it out.
Yeah, and I saw that piece in your book, and I was like, and we talked earlier how I feel like we may think a lot alike, but you know how to articulate it in books. And I read it, and I was like, yes, that's what I've been always thinking about that, but I just couldn't say it that way. And in particular, it is, I think you mentioned either a podcast I listened to or maybe it was in the book that, you know, you're still running a business,
Yeah.
right? So it's, as an HR person, maybe you are going to inform, maybe it is technically on the gray area of legal, whatever it is, but ultimately it's your job to inform,
Yeah.
right? But the business has to decide what risk they're willing to take.
Too often, like I was always told in my career by executives that I worked with, and like we had talked about, like the Pomida example where I got to travel with executives on a weekly basis. What I always took this as a big compliment. They meant it as a compliment, which you are unlike every HR person we've ever worked with. And they said that because they would always use their HR as a hammer of saying, you can't do it. They were the no police. And for me, it was like, it's my job to advise you of risk, because everything we do is going to have some risk. It's not my job to stop risk. That's your job as an executive. If you decide that that's what we should do, my job is just to advise you. Okay, hey, we're going to go and we're going to fire this person. There's a 25% chance we could end up in court, and there's this and there's this. Let me advise you of the risk. But like so many of the HR people would go, no, you can't fire them, or we will be in court. And they would go, oh my gosh, you're my legal person, you're my HR person, so I'm going to listen to you. They told me I couldn't do it. You can do anything. If you wanted to kill that employee, you can do it. I'm going to advise you, there's 100% chance you're going to jail.
Right.
But I can't stop you from doing that. No, I mean, I physically probably could, but that's where I think the differences were. And to them, they looked at it as you were more of a business person than an HR person, because they had just never been around an HR person that talked like that.
Yeah, I imagine. And I'm going to go to question number 3.
3.
They may have not had an HR person that talked like this as well. Why does time to fill suck?
Because there's no causation between how fast you fill a job and how good you are at recruiting. You can correlate it, and many of us do. In fact, the vast majority of the world correlates that if I recruit faster, I recruit better. I could actually argue the exact opposite. The faster you recruit, you actually might be recruiting worse, because you're not giving the process time enough to actually find really good quality people, or getting enough good quality people into the pipeline to actually apply for a job. To me, time to fill is a health metric. If you know in your marketplace for a certain role, it's 25 days to find a good candidate, and you're at 50 days, okay, you're ill, you have cancer, there's a problem. But if you're at 26 days or 24 days, you're just in the ballpark, you're fine. And that's all that means. It doesn't mean you're better. Now, I've had people argue with me, like in high volume environment, if I can't fill a shift, or a salesperson that, if it's open another day, I lose so much revenue. I'll give you that, right? You could argue then that if you're a little faster, then you're going to save some revenue, or you're going to fill a shift. And, so being faster is better. But I could also, again, argue back to say, okay, even though you hired that salesperson a day quicker, you hired the wrong salesperson, and ultimately down the road, exponentially you're losing sales. And so again, for me, it's just there's no causation there between faster and better. And I think we've made a miscalculation to correlate those two together.
I read that, and I think that was in your chapter on technology that I picked that out of. And by the way, obviously we were going to have a lot of HRIS people listening.
Yeah.
There's a ton of interesting, if you just go through the table of contents on Amazon, I think you guys will see what I'm talking about in this book. And there were so many little intriguing chapters. So I had to pick out just a few to prepare for the podcast. But then that chapter led me to chapter 12, where you're talking about like good metrics.
Yeah.
So I'm going to add on to this. You talked about quality to hire, which I very much agree with. Yeah. How do you like to measure the quality of the hire? Like, what are you looking for? Are you looking for the longest tenure? Maybe they're short tenure, but they were the most productive. Do you have any sort of magical mathematical equation for quality of hire?
There is one in the book. I think that's the hardest part about quality of hire, because like every survey you find in our industry, if you're asking like CHROs or heads of talent, they're always going to have quality of hire up there as a really important thing. Oh my gosh, yeah, we're so concerned about our quality of hire. And then you ask 100 of them to tell us how you measure it, and you would have 100 different explanations. And so for me, that's a broken metric in our industry, because if it was a good metric, you would have one standard metric that you could actually, everybody could go and say, oh yeah, here's quality of a hire in our organization, from a health system to a supermarket to a restaurant to a manufacturing facility. And people could actually go, okay, now we understand what quality of hire is. But what I find is that so often somebody will come in and say, oh, well, if a person stays for 90 days, then we consider them a good quality of hire. Really? Again, bad correlation, because that person could actually just be awful, but you can't, the hiring manager couldn't find anybody else. So they just keep this low mid performer in place. Is that a better quality than the person that actually left? What I find is it's a really hard in long-term metric to gain, because you're talking about performance, right? You're talking about, okay, hey, here's where I hired somebody. Here's, where we actually got them from, all these other things. And there's performance. Now, what we're seeing in the industry right now is like a lot of companies and a lot of the technology companies have decided, well, what if we just went to the hiring manager and said, well, hey, if you have a chance to fill this position again, would you select this person over another time? And they're saying that would show if it's a good quality or not.
That I like.
Yeah, and it's flawed to this point of, you have to have a good culture, because what you might have is you might go, well, wait a minute, you're asking a hiring manager to really kind of identify whether they did a good job or not, because you're saying, oh no, I would never hire that person again. Well, aren't you saying then that you made a bad job selecting as a hiring manager? So you're kind of incentivizing them to actually say it's a good hire, it's a good quality of hire, because they don't want to rat themselves out on doing bad at selection. But if you have really good culture, and you're saying, look, we need to do this, because it's not just about you, it's also about us. There's many people that kind of come into this hire, and you don't leave them out on a limb by themselves. I think you can actually have a really good kind of a conversation around, does that actually mean, it's better quality? Because I think it takes us some time to really determine. So often we hire somebody and we think, oh, this person's going to be amazing. And then they just were great at interviewing, and maybe they were even being great at being assessed, but then their work ethic lacked, or maybe our culture just wasn't for them, or whatever that might be. It takes us a little bit to find that out. And so I actually like that. Even though there's some flaws in it, I think it's something that we can actually measure and sustain in a very easy way, versus some of the other stuff where you're going and looking at performance over time, and then going back and looking at source and all of these other things to get a kind of a mathematical quality of hire.
Yeah, and to me, it's the most important. It does take a little bit, can you calibrate it by just having not the hiring manager, but the hiring manager's manager make the determination whether that person, they would be hired that person again, or is there some way to kind of make it a little more objective?
Yeah.
But it's almost the most important
we would think
metric.
Yeah.
Yes.
We would think. I think in some positions it's really easy, right? Like if you think of sales positions, right? If you have, you can easily go and say, oh, this person's a great quality of hire because they're obviously selling more. And I'm like, well, but is it really quality, or is it just the person produces more because maybe they're a real a-hole and nobody likes them? They're just great at selling. So how do we define quality then becomes part of that issue as well. Beyond like a shadow of a doubt, I can go and be in a big group of speaking in front of HR or TA and ask them, hey, raise your hand if quality of hire matters. 99% of the room would raise their hand. And then, but when you ask them how they measure it, that's when they go, well, come on, Tim, if you hire someone that's hired, you have that gut feeling, and you're like, no, this is terrible. If we don't have a standard measure of this across the industry, we're failing that quality of hire. Or we've just come to saying, hey, quality of hire does matter. Every company is going to measure it their own way. And as long as they agree with it in the way how they measure it, good for them. And maybe some people will steal it and use it as well. But for the most part, we're all just going to have our own measure. But we don't say that. And I wish we would, because that's really where we're at right now today.
Now, the problem with what we're just talking about here is now every one of my clients is going to come to me and
give us a measure. Yeah.
They're going to want a user-defined field for measuring a-holism, right? And they're going to cross-calibrate on their hires.
Yep. No a-holes.
Yes. I used to love, was it Success Factors before they sold out? That was one of their mantras, no
Yeah.
a-holes. Mm, Let's go to, I believe we were question number 4.
4.
Can you explain your save strategy?
Yeah, I like again being someone that like grew up most of their career in TA and then have been bouncing back and forth in HR roles. I always saw that HR it was too easy for HR to fire somebody because they never got the work that like if you fire someone automatically, then you just went back to the TA team and said, okay, hire us another one. So we're the ones that got the work, even though you created the work because you just fired them. For me, is it goes back to the concept of when I hire somebody, I have all this hope and dreams that they're going to be this amazing employee, right? We went through the process and tested and we selected and interviewed and checked backgrounds and did all this great stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh, Troy is going to be the most amazing hire. And then somewhere down the road, all of a sudden, Troy wasn't the most amazing hire. And we decided to fire that person. And I thought, well, what if we decided instead to say, what if we had to save that person? What if we said, hey, you can't have another hire until you actually give this person all of your time and effort and energy to try to save them? The other thing would be is what we did when I was at Applebee's, it was like when somebody said they turned their 2 weeks in, or we found out somebody was interviewing for another job, we would start a save strategy where we would pull them in to not, and again, not their current like one level boss, because usually that was probably part of the problem of what was going on. We need to elevate them up. And so if we really valued the employee, we would actually bring them into an executive team and say, okay, hey, how do we actually keep you? Now, there's a couple of things that have to happen. One would be that we would only do that for people that we would say are A and B players. If they were a C player, I don't necessarily want to keep that person. So if they're coming to me and saying 2 weeks, something cool, fist bump, have a good life. If it was an A or B player who I considered valuable to the company, then I have to figure out what do I need to do to save them. And then what we found was quite often it was very little things that we had to do to keep that person happy and safe. Now, we didn't consider the person a save unless actually stayed on for another year. And what we found was when we started a save strategy and we did it with our general manager level. So we picked out a certain level of individual that we wanted to do this with. And we had like a 40% save strategy. So people who we knew were going to leave us, we actually turned on the charm and re-recruited and tried to meet their needs of what they were really looking for. And 40% of the time we were able to keep them for at least another year. That was the measure of success.
Well, when I saw that, like I said, I absorbed a ton of your podcasts and material last week in preparation. And, I loved that because I agree. I don't think people think about that as a solution, right?
Yeah.
To take some pressure off your talent acquisition, just keep the person you have.
We just
And
throw away people too easy. Like I always go back and say the day that you made them in the offer, how did you feel about that person? Like, oh my gosh, I was so excited about them getting started. I couldn't wait. And then literally sometimes it's 6 months later, 9 months later, like you're like, this person's a piece of garbage. And you're like, no, they're not. We didn't hire a piece of garbage.
right. Yes. And it's something that principle can apply in a lot of situations, right? You've got a customer, or in this case, Chicago Public Schools is not my client, but I'd love them to be. They had a program that I read about where they evaluate 8th graders, and then they figure out who they believe are the most at risk at not graduating. And then they just throw enormous resources at that population. And as I understand, it's been incredibly effective. So it applies probably to HR, talent acquisition, but in a lot of different ways.
Like everyone always thinks it's about money, and many times it is. But like, I mean, I'll give you one quick example. We had a GM of the year. So in the Applebee's environment, like she had won 2 years in a row of being the top GM over 2,500 GMs. Amazing person. She trained other managers for her. She was but she worked for a district manager who was a very traditional kind of like baby boomer type. She was a single mom. Her son ended up getting to an age where on Saturday mornings he was going to play soccer, right? For one of the little kid soccer like things. But in her job, she was supposed to open on Saturdays and be in the kitchen and getting everything rolling for the day. And that was just part of the schedule she had. But she, decided she wanted to be able to go to see her son's soccer matches. And the district manager was like, no, we can't do that. And so Chili's across the street, the guy was like, yeah, you can do that. And then,
Right.
we'll make that happen for you. And that was all she wanted. This person, literally a GM of the year in that environment, made the company maybe $1.5 million a year in net, for that store. She was an amazing person, and all she wanted. And so again, we couldn't. The safe strategy was making sure she had a chance to voice what was going on above her direct line supervisor, because this person he was just like, oh no, like even though she was 2-time GM of the year, she's really fallen off. And like we were hearing all of these things, right? Her performance was
Right.
gone and she might have a drinking problem. And like, like it was like, I mean, literally like saying stuff that you were like, holy crap, like what happened to this person? When in reality, because in his mind, and we ended up having to go through and have this conversation, like, well, what's really wrong with her doing this? And he's like, well, then every other general manager I have working for me, all the other 15 are going to want the exact same thing. And you're like, that's a lie. They all don't have a 4-year-old son playing soccer on a Saturday morning. Like that's
Right.
just untrue, but that's what he was worried about. He wasn't really worried about keeping her as much as he was worrying about, creating chaos within his district.
I know we have to get you out of here in about 7 minutes, so let me get
Yeah.
to question
5,
5, the final lightning round question. So, in your book, which I believe is, I know that there is a SHRM stamp
Yeah.
there on the book. So, I won't say controversial, but if you just read the headline of the chapter, maybe controversial. What two either thoughts or chapters were you worried that SHRM might kick out of your book?
I was 100% positive they wouldn't allow me to write a white guy's guide to diversity recruiting. That was a chapter. I figured that would be edited. They would change the title. They would talk, differently. And they didn't. They said no. Like this is on you. Like go ahead and you discuss this. And then the other one, like there was probably another one around like hire more pretty people. Again, controversial from that standpoint, but I think they were like, it's challenging how people think about things in our space. And they ultimately said, for you as an author, if you're comfortable with this, we're going to let it go. And you defend it. So,
Well, I'll tell you what, man. Sells books. I thought I could go to the library and just get the book.
Took this book out in 1971.
Yes, and I returned it in 1971.
Yeah, 71. That was my first year on the job. Bad year for libraries.
I returned that book. I remember it very specifically.
You're a comedian. You make people laugh.
I try.
You think this is all a big joke, don't you?
And I was like, man, I want to know the answer to that question. There's not any detail in the chapters. Like, I want to see how he gets out of this. You know?
I'm
all right,
fascinated by the pretty research, by the way. I mean, just historically and like how potentially we got to this, but like there's this belief in our world that if you're pretty, you're dumb. And in reality, genetically, that actually is the opposite, right? Like, I mean, there's just a lot of research behind it. So I think it's fascinating. I also think it's fascinating because if you start talking about it, all of a sudden you'll find people will be offended that you're talking about pretty. And I think it's sad because I'm like, well, what are you saying about yourself if you're offended by this? You're thinking you're not pretty. And really, pretty's in the eye of the beholder, right? I think everybody is beautiful in their own way. But like somebody actually doesn't think they're pretty and then they're offended by it. And I'm like, oh, that's sad,
I looked at the first couple of pages of that, but that's what is getting me back into the book. A couple of those chapter titles there. All right, so I know we've got to get you out of here. So this is an HRIS Careers podcast, right? These are the people that are listening. So in your chapter that addresses, you call it the tech stack for the rest of us. And this is really talking really at the
Recruiting.
talent acquisition. Yep. Part of the tech stack. You use this word, or now this sentence. If you suck at recruiting, the only thing technology will do is make you suck faster.
Exactly. It's one of my favorite quotes, and it's been used a lot. And thankfully, I think for the most part, I get attributed for it. Because it's, whether you're talking about TA tech or HR tech, the technology isn't necessarily the foundation of better HR or better TA. It's having really great processes and people, and then the technology layered in is like the holy grail of making this really good. But you can't have a broken process or a really bad HR policy and think that the technology is going to fix it. It actually just, whatever you're doing bad is just going to do it a lot faster and more efficient. And so I try to tell people that all the time. Like, and what we always tend to believe is like, most of the time I'll get a call from like a TA leader or CHRO who doesn't think recruiting is going well for them. And they'll say, well, we just need a new ATS. And I'm like, you probably don't. I mean, you might, right? Like you might have something that's dated, but first let's take a look at, are you using your technology at a superior level? Like, I think you should become super users of your technology first before you buy anything new. First, because a lot of times they'll say, oh, well, we're currently using ATS A. And I'm thinking, well, it's not a bad ATS. And they're like, well, we think we should go to B. And I'm like, okay, also not a bad ATS, but 90% of what they do is the same. So what are you really missing from A to B? And they can't tell you. And so I'm like, well, first, how about you become a super user of technology A, and then tell me what it really is lacking from a feature standpoint that you believe you need, and then let's go find that. Or a lot of times, the actual technology they're using actually has the feature set they want. They just have never turned it on, or they never implemented it correctly, or something like that. And so it's so interesting. And I think that ultimately what I usually find again is they'll go, well, they won't use the technology we have. Well, that's not a technology problem. That's a you problem, right? That's a design problem, a process problem. It's not necessarily a technology problem. So that's where I'm always like, I'm just a fan of saying, let's be good at what we do and then allow the technology to make us even better.
Right. And again, I'll just speak to the HRIS audience out there. In that chapter, number one, you can take the book to your meetings and say, Tim Sackett said, and talk about this. And he says, don't break the software, right? Don't use it for things that's not intended for. So that is definitely number one. But there's just a nice roadmap. So if you're an HRIS and maybe you're not as familiar with the TA function, he goes through like a stack of, here is the basic stack.
Yeah.
And then here are some things that you can layer on. So, again, if you're not really in the TA world as much, maybe you're more came from a coding background and you got into HRIS in a management position, it's a nice guide to keep at your desk to understand the basics of the talent acquisition department.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, we are at the hour, so we want to get you out of here. Where can people connect with you and get the book, which I highly recommend?
Yeah, book's on Amazon, so it's easy to find. Both of them are out there. Volume 1 is just the Talent Fix, and then Volume 2 is the Talent Fix Volume 2. People always ask me, do I need to read the first one? Like, no, get the second one. The second one has everything the first one has, plus 40% new material. So go for Volume 2. That'll kill two birds with one stone. TimSackett.com, or just Google Tim Sackett. My SEO is pretty strong on the Google machine. So
yes, that's because you blog almost every day.
yeah,
Is that what is it?
for like
at
for the
TimSackett.com?
last decade. Yeah.
We certainly appreciate you taking the time to do this for the HRIS Careers community. We'll talk to you next time.
Here we go.